This is Talk of the Bay. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and I'm speaking here with Sara Niedzwieck. She is an associate professor of politics at UC Santa Cruz and is involved with a number of things. She watches South American politics closely. That's why I've asked you here, Sara, to talk about what's happening, if we can even figure it out, in Venezuela with the recent actions of the US government. So, just I'll ask you to see if you can summarize your take when you heard that Maduro had been kidnapped along with his wife and brought to the US to try him.
Yeah, hi Rachel. Thank you for having me today in the radio. And so I have to say that, when I heard about the news, I was opening my eyes on a Saturday morning, and my husband blurted the news that Venezuela had been attacked. And so initially I was in complete shock, right? The US military capturing Nicolás Maduro, his wife, in the middle of the night, bringing them to New York and charging them on drug trafficking, narco terrorism, and the list goes on. And so, my initial personal reaction was shock. But then, after I had my morning coffee and after some days have gone by and had a chance to really think a little bit more about it and read some analysis, it's really not surprising at all. I mean, from a historical perspective, the US has intervened in Latin America numerous times, especially supporting coups, military dictatorships in the Cold War in the 60s and 70s. People have been mentioning that the most similar example is when President H.W. Bush attacks in 1989 Panama's president Noriega, very similar to Maduro, flew Noriega to Miami, charged him for drug trafficking, and then Noriega spent many years in prison. And so, also when and where it happened is not surprising, given that President Trump had been pressuring Venezuela since his first administration through economic sanctions, but then more recently through striking boats at the sea. So, in that sense, it's not surprising. At the same time, what is extremely surprising, at least personally, is the decision of the U.S. administration to take over running Venezuela. I think that is decidedly very surprising. The idea that the US could run a country directly from afar, that President Trump himself, Marco Rubio, Peter Hegseth, could run a complex country like Venezuela. What I'm trying to say is that, of course, the US can overthrow and has overthrown Latin American governments by force. And they have done this very successfully, quote unquote, in the sense that the US has the strongest military in the world. Now, the question is, what happens after that, right? Can the US pull off running a country? I personally don't see many paths for success here. I don't see how this administration can avoid an endless war, which was precisely what President Trump campaigned against. So beside being morally wrong, I think it's illegal under international law. I think it also seems strategically and political problematic for the future of Venezuela.
Well, let's take the legal part because the pretense under which he was taken was under drug trafficking laws. I heard a Republican congressional representative from California talk on the radio earlier today on the BBC, and he was interviewed and he said he's a narco terrorist and he's a wanted fugitive, which surprised me because he was in his own country. So, fugitive from whose laws, under what violation? So, again, can this administration make up a reason why someone's being arrested and then try them later on that reason? So, you said it's against international law. It sounds like the Republican Congress doesn't, or at least this one Congress member didn't think so. Thought that they were within their rights under a police action, not a military action.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. For me, there's no question that from an international law perspective, that this is illegal, right? The military incursion into a sovereign state to capture a head of state is a clear violation of the United Nations Charter. And so, under the UN Charter, the use of force is only allowed under three circumstances, basically. If the US can claim that it was acting on self-defense, which is not the case, Venezuela was not attacking the US. If the host state consents to a military incursion, which of course Venezuela didn't agree with its incursion, or when the UN Security Council authorizes the attack. And of course, the UN Security Council didn't authorize the attack, and many in the UN are condemning the actions of the Trump administration, including countries like Brazil, Russia, South Africa, allies like Spain, for example. And then, heads of state have immunity generally under international law. So for me, there's no question that this was a violation of international law and illegal. Now, as you say, Rachel, this is being framed as a law enforcement operation and not as a military action. I think that doesn't find, again, support in international law, because a state simply cannot carry out, as you are saying very well in framing your question, a law enforcement operation in another country without that country explicitly consenting to it, right? Without consent, it becomes a military invasion, basically. It's not enough to portray Maduro as a criminal and forcibly remove him, that, doing so is a violation of sovereignty. And so if it is, a declaration of war, then this has to go through Congress. This is a military action and it's not a law enforcement operation. So, I mean, like, having said all of this and firmly believing that this was an illegal action by the Trump administration, I don't personally think that Congress or the UN will be willing, or if they are willing, will be able to do absolutely anything about it, unfortunately.
Let's talk about what's happening in the country as of today, anyway. We heard some reporting out of the country that the vice president is now the acting interim president, and they are no different than Maduro, essentially, and that the military still and the militia are still, having these big parades and pretending like everything's normal, except that the president is not there anymore, but everything will just carry on. And there are some reports of anyone who's dissenting in public, journalists, the public wanting to, celebrate his demise, are getting jailed or attacked or killed. So it's hard to tell because of the reporting being spotty coming out of the country and people being afraid to speak out, but there are definitely mixed reaction on the ground there. And that may be because people are just terrified and unsure. There's some jubilation on the part of people here who are Venezuelan expats, I guess you would say. But what's going on in the country from what you can tell? Any reports you've read, any reactions? It's certainly not black and white, what's happening there. There's a lot of mixed reaction. There's not a lot of people who are super sad, it seems like, to see Maduro go, but at the same time, there are these enforced parades in support of him. So how do you understand all their reactions?
Yeah. As you say, it's very hard to tell, right? Especially from people in Venezuela, given the little reporting we get and the limited freedom of expression that there is in the country. And so I think you're totally right, Rachel, that many people are not sad to see him go, right? Maduro was not a democratically elected leader, right? Since 2024 elections, clearly marred by irregularities, right? In those elections, it became clear that he wasn't the winning candidate. The government wasn't willing to release the paper tallies of the electronic vote count. The results was very different from where the polls had landed. And so it's clear that the opposition, or it's clear to many that the opposition had won. At the same time, Maduro was not as charismatic as Hugo Chavez was, his predecessor, and the country was in a deep economic crisis. So many people are happy to see him go, I think. Just judging by the 8 million Venezuelans that had to flee the country in the past 15 years because they were escaping political oppression and the economic crisis.
So many people
So
are out of the country, and some I think it was 4 million. They weren't allowed to vote, or they were being blocked from voting for various reasons, and they were supposed to come back into the country to vote. So there was a huge block of people who got disenfranchised, from what I understand. Um,
absolutely,
I
yeah.
heard a BBC reporter ask this question. I thought it was a really good question to ask. But could it be possible that, with the intervention or military action on the part of the United States against Venezuela, that it could eventually end up in better economic state, but worse democratic state?
I mean, that's a really good question. I can't think of an example in which, after a US military intervention, the country ends up economically and politically healthier than it was before, right? And we also need to think about, and you were talking about the vice president and where the loyalties lie inside Venezuela, right? I mean, the strategy of the President Trump's administration is a very risky one, right? They decided not to coordinate with the opposition, which had won the elections, or, Maria Corina Machado, who won the Peace Prize and has been lauding Trump all this time. They are coordinating with Maduro's vice president. And it's not clear that she's in a very tough spot, right? On one hand, she obviously is being pressured by the most powerful country in the world, and so being threatened by President Trump. And on the other hand, she has to respond to her own bases, which are very Chavista supporters. And so they just got rid of the president of Maduro, and the assumption behind it is that the rest of the government would follow through with Trump's demands, which I don't think is clearly what's going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, if you don't have the support of the leadership, then how can you have a peaceful transition to democracy in this country and provide the level of stability for stable and productive investment to happen? And so I do not know what the end game is and for how long the US is planning to run this country from afar.
It doesn't seem like there was an end game in mind, just an action, without thinking through all the scenarios that could happen. And yes, it seems very surprising that they wouldn't have contacted Maria Machado, who won the Peace Prize. It also seems odd that a president who doesn't really have much stake or value in his own country for democracy, ergo the recent murder today of somebody in a car during an ICE protest. It seems to me like the last person you'd want to elect to help you build a democracy is someone who's tearing their own down in this country. And so it's laughable to me that the person who is undermining it directly in our own country would think of themselves as a democracy builder.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, sorry, Richie. I totally agree with you. And I think that what I would add is that democracy is not the goal. And, I think different from other incursions in other parts of the world where the US intervention had the discourse that democracy was the desired outcome. Here, they are not even pretending that the administration is hoping for a democratic Venezuela. And really, President Trump's speech on the economic interest and oil extraction is really what is running the intervention this time around, not even under the pretense of establishing a democratic regime. So, we have to give President Trump that at least this is a very sincere goal, whereas in the past, perhaps there were economic interests that superseded democratic interests, but they are hidden behind the curtain of trying to impose democracy, when here they are not even hiding it. They're being very open about wanting to extract oil.
Yes, that is true. And you could say, at least he's being honest, but you don't want to use those two words too often, at least, because that means
Yeah.
at minimum. And we hopefully aspire past the minimum. The rest of the world's bound to be looking at this in different ways, especially the neighbors in South America and Cuba in particular. Can you talk about sort of the ripple effect this is having on jangling the nerves of neighbors that our ally, supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly opens a precedent, right? If the Trump administration sees this action in the short term and arrives to the conclusion that they succeeded at no consequence domestically and internationally, then nothing is going to stop them from intervening unilaterally in other countries, in Cuba, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Greenland, right? Um, I think, I hope, at least, when we think about Mexico, I think it's very unlikely that the US would intervene in Mexico because it would generate an unprecedented crisis in the southern border. But, after Venezuela, nothing is impossible. And I think Cuba, the case you ask about, that's not that unlikely. Of course, there is the Bay of Pig invasion precedent of the invasion trying to oust President Fidel Castro in 1961 in the hands of then President Kennedy. That, of course, is seen historically as a complete failure of the US. Of course, the Communist Party is still in power in Cuba. And so, and the response was an embargo that is only affecting Cubans themselves and has put Cuba closer to then the Soviet Union and then Russia. Now, if that historic precedent says something to Trump, probably he won't intervene. But of course, Cuba is in a completely different position, and Russia is in a completely different position today. So I don't think that Russia would answer for its ally this time around as it did in 1961.
In closing, what will you be watching in the next few days and weeks to understand what's unfolding?
I think I want to know what the political leaders in Venezuela are doing, how they are reacting, and how the military in Venezuela is reacting. Are they going to respond and abide by President Trump's demands, or are they going to fight back? And I think that's going to be very telling for the outcome, at least in the middle term.
What about political prisoners that were jailed under Maduro? Will they be released now?
I mean, that could be probably a negotiation card for the administration. Maybe that's the only card that the vice president, now President Delcy Rodriguez, has. And so that is likely, it is likely that I think probably that the prisoners are released. Yeah.
And one of them is the former president-elect. Well, he ran for president and was jailed for it. So
Yeah.
they have some pretty high-level prisoners. Well, thank you for your perspective. It's really great to hear your wisdom and thoughts on this, and we'll no doubt be back in touch as the weeks and months progress and follow this story carefully.
Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me.
Thank you. That's Sara Niedzwieck. She is Associate Professor of Politics at UC Santa Cruz. Thank you so much for being on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you.